It's a real pleasure to be here. Let me congratulate what I think is a really effective team in organizing this conference. And I really enjoyed the first conversation in the panel before this. When I think about climate change, Debbie noted 15 years isn't that long. We go back 27 years when the international community first came together and said we need to do something about climate change at the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. Then the goal was a somewhat ambiguous goal of wanting to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the global climate. And there's a lot of ambiguity in that goal. There was also a lot of ambiguity in how we might, around the world, implement that goal. And a lot of the international negotiations has been around both the goal and trying to, I would say, nudge, because we can't really compel in international negotiations, nudge countries to do more to mitigate climate change. Over time, we've seen a call to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees C or well below 2 degrees C, and now concerns about wanting to limit warming to no more than 1.5 degrees C. And a lot of that is motivated by our concerns about climate risk, and a lot of that, the first panel this morning focused on these climate risks, how they are reflected in an impact in our daily lives here in the US, but it's also important to think about this around the world. I want to shift gears a little bit and think, though, about when we think about the impacts of climate change, and think about what I would call carbon risk. What does the prospect of meaningful policies to mitigate climate change have on the value of assets, capital, the decisions that we make as businesses, the decisions we make as individuals, that are all part of, hopefully, a meaningful, adequate response to the climate change challenge. And part of that gets to the question then about sort of how do we think about driving the changes in that behavior. How do we get businesses to change their investment decisions, to source lower or zero carbon sources of electricity, try to invest more in energy efficient technologies, to sort of change their long-term strategies and where they make their investments that reflects what they think will be the incentives coming from public policy. Because as President Paxson noted this morning, the externality here is challenging. There's very little incentive for us as individuals or for businesses to internalize that externality absent a meaningful crafting of public policy. And in recent years, there's been more and more discussion. It's great to see Senator Whitehouse here, who's been leading that discussion in the Senate, to think about how we could price carbon. And whether that is through cap and trade, as we've seen in some parts of the United States and some countries around the world, is it through a carbon tax? Is it through other kinds of policies that have effectively a shadow price, if you will, on carbon? And by shadow price, I mean it may not be explicitly saying, here's the price on carbon that your business has to face, but you realize that the policy is changing the incentives for how you use carbon-intensive technologies or power, and why it is in your economic interest to start to find and source lower and zero carbon alternatives. The challenge, of course, is that there's a fairly heterogeneous mix of carbon prices around the world, and so I want to talk a little bit about that here today, and about whether or not there's a potential for us to eventually converge on a price, or at least a range of prices. So first I want to draw some from some of the leading scholars out there who've thought about this, with sort of different perspectives on carbon prices. So Bill Nordhaus recently received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his contributions for how we think about the economics of climate change, has written a lot about this over many years, and really was the first person to talk about how we could promote a cost-effective approach to mitigating climate change through pricing carbon. And has written many papers showing what the potential benefits would be if we could cost-effectively do this, not just across our communities and across the country, but across the world, to deliver on a global, stable climate. So sort of a key insight that comes from a lot of his analysis is the importance of having this kind of common price to internalize that climate change externality. That way we're sort of leveraging the sort of ingenuity in the private sector for people to figure out what's the lowest cost ways to reduce our emissions. And if some people in some parts of the world or in some businesses have a lot of really low cost ways of doing it for a given carbon price, let's give them that incentive through a price signal. And if other parts are more expensive, then we probably want to ask less of them in the near term to reduce their emissions. Having said that, you don't find, of course, a global carbon price. And if you look at some of the work of Lynn Ostrom, who's written some about sort of the polycentric governance of climate change. We have these different sort of centers. There's sort of international negotiations run through the UN. There's actions occurring in national capitals for national policies. But certainly when you look at the US, we look at Sacramento as a center of activity. We look at the Northeast as a center of activity. We even see among some of our more progressive companies as sort of a center of activity. So you have these different centers of activity going on, and they're all sort of undertaking a different set of actions and policies that at the end of the day have sort of a different impact on the price of carbon. But between drawing from some of the fundamental insights of environmental economics that Professor Nordhaus has advanced, some of the insights of Professor Ostrom, trained as a political scientist, but she's part of our tribe as an economist, because of her great contribution. She was awarded, I believe she's one of only two, correct me if I'm wrong, two non-economists to win an economics Nobel Prize. Maybe just three, but it's a short list. Then we look at some of the insights from new institutional economics, from Professor Coates and Dimsets, who thought a lot about sort of the theory of the firm. And part of this is, at the end of the day, what we agree to in international negotiations. And I don't want to dismiss that as someone who in the past in the government has contributed and participated in those negotiations. But those goals mean less than what are the changing incentives within firms where the decision on how to produce energy and consume energy are being made every day. And those decisions are going to be influenced, of course, by the public policies, but how the firm takes what they think are the signals from policymakers and understand what the incentives are from the design of meaningful public policy is going to influence how they organize the firm, how they craft strategy for the firm, how they make different investment decisions. So one thing I want to say, reflecting sort of different perspectives about how we think pricing carbon can have, is to think about sort of what do businesses actually say to us when they use what's so-called internal carbon prices. And what used to be called the sort of Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, has been quite effective in providing information. They survey a lot of companies and disclose what those companies are doing on climate change. Some of them may have emission goals, but some of them are now also disclosing their carbon disclosure, their internal carbon prices. So there's a couple different ways we can think about that. One is they may be disclosing when they say, here's the price that we use in our internal investment decisions, in our strategy making. It may reflect what they think the future climate policy is going to be. It may be that they are actually responding to the people who are the owners of the company. They're responding to the pressures from investors. And they may say, some of this we may sometimes use in terms of activist investors trying to get companies to be, say, a more progressive, more focused on climate change. It may be that some of the investors in the firm have a long-term plan to be in the company. That they think about why they make investments, they care about the long-term returns, and they're concerned about what maybe a changing policy environment, what a potential changing in carbon risk could mean for the value of the firm. There's also the less charitable interpretation, which is this is greenwashing. That this is a company saying, oh, we do X, Y, and Z because we care about the climate, and they're just trying to change the conversation because they don't really want to do something really ambitious. Maybe they want to say to the regulators, no, you don't have to do much. We're actually taking actions now. But it's all ways to try to actually, if anything, sort of weaken the prospect for more ambitious climate policy. Now, to illustrate this, in the CDP, when they put out their annual report on this, they put out for those companies that agree to disclose their internal carbon prices. This is not the universe. This is showing sort of the distribution from the 2017 report. And so, for one thing, that you see is that it's not like what, say, the Bill Nordhaus view of the world would say is the sort of preferred cost-effective approach. This is not a single point. This is a pretty large distribution. We see the average, the mean, is about $40 a ton of CO2. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that is about in line with what was the social cost of carbon, which I'll return to in a moment. The social cost of carbon that was used in the Obama administration for valuing the damages associated with emitting another ton of carbon dioxide. But part of it, too, is that you see there's tremendous variation. And some of that depends on how they're using this. So Microsoft is kind of on the lower end of the range here at about $10 a ton. But it's a real $10 a ton. They actually are using this as a kind of internal tax in the company. The monies then get put into a fund to help invest in sort of clean energy efficiency projects. Others are more like a kind of robustness check on investments. So ExxonMobil, which is actually near the right end at about $80 a ton, it's really a kind of sensitivity analysis of if we're going to undertake this development of an oil and gas field, do we think that a really aggressive climate change policy would affect whether or not it is in our interest now to undertake that investment? And there's a question about whether or not at the end of the day they're really changing their investments, although I've had conversations with representatives in the oil industry where they say, we don't want to say which investments we abandoned, because we actually sold some of those assets to other people. But there are investment plans that we changed in the case. I was at a conference just about 6 weeks ago, or 8 weeks ago at Harvard Law School, where someone from ConocoPhillips said, we actually abandoned a project, and we sold off that asset because of what the internal carbon pricing analysis said. But there's tremendous heterogeneity when we see this in the US. We see this around the world as well. Now, I think if we're going to be successful in tackling climate change, though, it's going to be useful if we can try to converge on a price. And part of that is that not just because I'm an economist and I want to try to realize a Bill Nordhaus vision of the world of sort of a common carbon price and drive cost effectiveness, but I think it's important from the political economy. And I'll get to that a little bit at the end of the talk as well. That in order to get ambitious action here and around the world, to be able to do something sort of comparable across countries, doing something comparable across industries, is going to be important. Now, some of the candidates are, one, we could say the least cost carbon price necessary to limit warming to 2 degrees C. Okay, one reason why I say this is that you can go to the 2015 Paris Agreement, which actually makes a reference to, and Timmons made a point of this in his talk at the beginning, that what has been agreed to in terms of the pledges under the Paris Agreement is not sufficient when we look at what a least cost path to 2 degrees C would say. I mean, they're really wonking out in these international agreements now when they're making reference to least cost emission scenarios that come out of the IPCC, but the language is in there and saying the pledges aren't doing enough, we need to think about a least cost path. A second might be, in part because this actually informed a lot of the regulatory analysis that the Obama administration did from 2010 through 2016, say, let's look at the damages. What are the damages of emitting another ton of CO2? Which conversely means, what are the benefits if we actually reduced that ton of CO2? How should that inform our public policy? And this is something which has also been worked on in collaboration with Mexico and Canada, and that other countries are thinking about using as well. The current administration is using a value that is dramatically lower. If you wanted to get into it, we could talk about that a little bit later. And then finally, you could just say, wait, why don't we just look at what prices are and policies being used right now? And that's kind of what you might think of as from a firm. If you're running a business, you might say, well, what are the prices we face because of government regulation? Isn't that what I should be using to inform my decision making and the investments that we make? So the thing is, when we look at some of the uses around the world, one thing that's important to recognize is that there's not just that variation in the US, which is reflected in the top bar there, and that's showing you sort of the 25th to 75th percentile of the distribution for the US. You see a lot of variation for other countries as well. But there's sort of two things to note when you compare that to the 2 degrees C pathway range and the world social cost of carbon range. First is, no one really has companies using internal carbon prices consistent with the 2 degrees C pathway. Okay, so that distribution for 2 degrees C pathway is much higher in the implicit carbon price than what we're doing in any of these other countries around the world. The other thing too is when we say there's kind of a focal price. What's the right price to get us to 2 degrees C? The modelers tell us, well, it depends on how you get there. And there's a lot of different prices, and there's actually a lot of distribution about that. Likewise, over the social cost of carbon. What do we think of the damages are in the future? Well, there's a lot of different ways we can actually estimate that. That generates a distribution, so it becomes a little bit more challenging to say there's a single focal price for either one of those. A different way to think about this is to compare these internal carbon prices to sort of current policies on the books. This looks at the OECD's effective carbon rates, or ECRs, which is reflected in sort of the dark shading there, or what we think is going to be the cost of implementing the Paris pledges. And this reflects the modeling work that I did with a number of teams in the US and Europe and Japan to try to model what we think the nationally determined contributions, the INDCs, agreed to in Paris, what that will mean in terms of implicitly the price that you need to put on your economy to deliver on that goal. And again, we see that the internal carbon prices that are being used, which is the light gray shaded area, tend to differ significantly from what is necessary to deliver on the pledges in Paris. So there's a sense where what's being revealed by these businesses is that they don't think these countries are necessarily going to be delivering on their Paris pledges. So let me close by, in what is probably the last 10 or 15 seconds that Timmons wants to give me, on why we should think we might converge on a focal carbon price. One, I think, is that there's preferences for a kind of level playing field. So businesses are very concerned about paying more for energy that's sourced from fossil fuels in one country than another because of the adverse competitiveness effects. I'm sure the senators are very much familiar with this kind of argument that is of keen interest to a lot of energy-intensive industries. A lot of senators from those states which have a lot of energy-intensive industry, a lot of the representatives in the labor community as well have this concern. And I think that because of that, and it's not just a US thing, this is an issue in Europe. And I think as China moves forward with their carbon pricing policy, they're also thinking about ways of trying to address their concerns about energy-intensive manufacturing. Those competitiveness pressures, I think, all create an incentive for countries to try to have comparable prices across their policy regimes. There's a sense in which we might see kind of a deference to a recognized authority. So the work that was done in the Obama administration was done by a lot of really smart people working through the best models in the peer-reviewed literature. It underwent a review by the National Academy of Sciences. Even though the current administration has abandoned it, a lot of the states are now using this to inform their design of energy and climate policy. So they're relying on that kind of expertise. So sort of once someone says, here is a credible expert statement of what we think the damages are, other people in the system of climate governance will adopt it. I think firms may want predictability. Sometimes they say certainty, but I think what they really mean is predictability. They live in an uncertain world. They would just like to know what the policy regime, I think, is going to look like and how they can predict the implications that has for their actions. On legal liability, so long as we don't get a sort of credible national policy, which we've been sort of working for some time now, we're seeing lawsuits that are proceeding in the legal system that may start to focus I think, companies' attention on what they may need to do to avoid or minimize their legal liability in the future. And that may also create a kind of focal point for this. There may be ways to use a Clean Air Act that would do this. And then, of course, if we had, say, an economy-wide carbon tax, that would serve as a very strong focal point and really guide then a lot of the investments, the innovation, et cetera, towards it. So it's a pleasure to be here today. I look forward to the conversation with the rest of my panelists as well as the rest of the conference committee.